Thank you all for joining us for the Building Mentorship Skills for Academic Careers workshop. Joining us today is Dr. Alyssa Crittenden, Associate Professor and Graduate Coordinator of the Department of Anthropology. She's going to discuss the basics of mentorship and how to cultivate a mentoring relationship with different types of mentees. And now I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to her to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Jasmine and Nev, for hosting this. When I was asked to give this presentation, I wasn't quite sure what the guidelines were. So I made my own guidelines up for the content that I thought would be useful. So the way that we will structure this today is I'm going to probably only talk for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then I thought we would open it up because I think one of the most useful things to do in terms of better understanding mentor-mentee relationships is to have a dialogue and to have a graduate faculty member here to answer questions that you might not necessarily feel comfortable asking in a different context in your own academic unit, in your own department, with your own advisor. So I just would also like to say that before we get started, that this is a safe space. So if students need to talk about stuff that might be a little controversial or stuff that they're not necessarily comfortable talking about, in terms of their relationships, we're going to respect that as we go through and have what I hope to be a very productive dialogue. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Let's hope this works. Also, just to let you know, we are in COVID times, and I am beaming in from my home in Boulder City. I have childcare responsibilities. I have pet responsibilities. So we may have some joiners from my end of things, but I'll try very hard. If I hear any dog barking, I'll try to mute myself so that it doesn't disrupt our conversation. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Okay, let's see, Jasmine, can you give me a thumbs up? And also, do you pronounce your name Jasmine or Yasmin?
It's Jasmine, and you do
Great.
have the thumbs up. I can see your screen.
Great.
Thank
All
you.
right, great. So you can see me, you can see the screen. Fantastic. Thank you, Jasmine. So today I'll be discussing building mentorship skills for academic careers. As you might imagine, this is a very big and broad topic, one that we will not be able to cover in a 45-minute dialogue. So that being said, I decided to go over some of the basics that we'll be covering today. But before we get started, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit so you know who you're talking to. I decided to go over my mentorship experience. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology. I'm also the graduate coordinator for our department and the chair of the graduate council. So I work very closely with the graduate college and graduate education at UNLV. And in general is very important to me. And it's something that I'm very dedicated to. It's something that I feel is a necessary engine of higher education, the academy, and science in general. And so I'm a big supporter of any type of opportunity for graduate students to better themselves professionally and personally that we can help facilitate here at UNLV. So I have 4 different types of mentorship experience. I was a peer mentor as an undergraduate university student at UC Santa Cruz. I have put our banana slug mascot right there for you on the bottom of your screen, should you be interested in seeing our Play-Doh reading banana slug right there. I was also a peer mentor as a doctoral student at, poor UC San Diego is going to be furious. Not UCSC, I see a typo in my slide. UCSD, University of California, San Diego, not in Santa Cruz. You'll see the Triton there as our mascot. And since coming to UNLV in 2011, I have mentored graduate students and postdocs. And I should also put under there that I've actually also mentored quite a few undergraduates, but that isn't really central to our dialogue today. I also am currently the chair of a tenure committee of one of my colleagues in the Department of Anthropology. So I have different types of mentorship experience myself. I've also been a mentee in all of these situations that you see in front of you. I was an undergraduate researcher. I was a doctoral student and graduate researcher. I was a postdoc, and I was an assistant professor who had a mentor. And I still have many mentors to this day. I am currently a mentor and a mentee in various different aspects of my life. And so I think that's another reason I wanted to introduce all of this, is so that we can really start to appreciate the fluidity and the kind of dynamic nature of these relationships. The most important role that we'll be discussing here today in the context of our talk is my role as a graduate mentor. A picture there of two of my current graduate students and my colleague, Dan Benishek, who also happens to be my spouse. And these were, we share one of the graduate students on the screen, and this was at their master's graduation. They're both now getting ready to begin their doctoral dissertation work, their research. It's very exciting. It's a very exciting time. I have other mentees as well, but this is the only photo I had where we were in our regalia at a graduation, and it feels, this is pre-masking mandates. This was several years ago, and this picture brings me a lot of joy, so I thought I would share it with you today. Okay, so let's get started. So we have a lot of time to discuss. The first thing we have to ask is, what is a mentor? There are just about as many resources available to you to learn about mentoring, mentorship, either on the mentoring side or the protege side, as you can Google. As fast as your fingers can search on a keypad, that's just about as many resources as you can collect. But it can be overwhelming to pull all of that information into one place. There's also a myriad of different types of definitions and different philosophies regarding mentorship. So what you are receiving today is my take on mentorship that I've learned over the last 20 or so years in this role. So the definition I really like is actually quite an old one. It's one that is that's circulated in the literature, as well as in a lot of resources and handbooks that you might locate online. And it's adapted from an article in the Journal of Teacher Education from 1988 by Anderson and Shannon. And the definition is that they provide is: the role of a mentor in this environment is to teach, sponsor, encourage, counsel, and befriend a less skilled or less experienced person for the purpose of promoting the latter's professional and or personal development. We're going to talk about personal development. We're going to talk about personal relationships as we move through the talk. But this is the one that I really like, and this is the one that I tend to adhere to. So in my own mentorship style, this tends to be kind of a guiding principle for me. So I thought I would share it with you today. Of course, you can have a mentor in many different contexts in your life. Today, we'll be talking about academic mentorship, as we are in an academic setting. And in this context, mentors should be providing guidance, professional development, and training on a career path or career paths. A good mentor, in my opinion, and this tends to be some of the characteristics that are often listed with defining the characteristics of good mentorship. A good mentor will work to actively demystify graduate school. And this typically begins oftentimes before you've even matriculated into a program. If you're in communication with a mentor, this means helping you navigate paperwork, helping you navigate logistics, helping you locate things like forms, or in our case at UNLV, this would be facilitating your understanding of the graduate handbook in your program, for instance. That's one way that graduate school can be demystified, making sure that expectations are set and known to the protege as they begin this process. Another characteristic is engaging the mentee in regular communication. I cannot stress this enough. I think that this is a very central component to a good mentor-mentee relationship. Also, providing encouragement and constructive feedback. Both of those are important components. One does not really work without the other. So from my position, my standpoint, I think that those are just the basics of what provides a good mentor. What are some of these characteristics kind of fleshed out in a little more detail? One important thing I think to remember is that relationships develop over time, right? So your relationship with your mentor will develop over time. It's impossible just to right out of the starting gate for, well, it is, I guess it is possible. There are some mentor-mentee dyads that have a great relationship right out of the starting gate where everything seems to just run very smoothly. But it is like any other relationship, and good relationships with good, solid communication with a good foundation require work. They require work on the side of both parties. Another important characteristic is an individualized relationship and plan. And I'll tell a story here. I'll tell a story on myself. I had a very good doctoral advisor, but it took us years to get into a good rhythm. It took us years to find good, strong communication skills. It took us years to figure out what dialogue worked for both of us. And so the first handful of years, it took me 2 years to get my master's degree, and it took me 6 years to get my PhD. So we were together for 8 years. It's a pretty long-standing relationship in your 20s. And the first few years were really rough. The first few years were very challenging, I think, for both of us. At one point, probably about 3 years in, I was feeling pretty frustrated because I felt that I was getting treated very differently than one of my friends, another graduate student who was not in my cohort, but worked in the same research group, in the same lab group, and we had the same advisor. So I went to my mentor and I asked her why she treated this person differently than me. And I will never forget her answer. And that was the start of a strong relationship that has persisted. I actually just spoke to her on the phone a handful of days ago. It's been a decade, 12 years since I graduated with my PhD, and we're still in regular communication. She's still, we'll talk about the ways relationships change in a moment. Our relationship most certainly has, but her response to that question I have always remembered. And her response to that question when posed to her was, I have to advise you differently because you are different people. You have a different set of needs, and it requires different types of investment from me. And that was one of the most useful things she could have told me, because then she said, my goal is to push you to meet your own potential. Your potential is going to be different than other students in the program, which means that it might seem like I'm pushing you harder or further or less hard compared to others, but it's because our relationship is based on me helping you to succeed on your path. And that was a very enlightening conversation, and I understood her approach much better. And it's one that I've taken on myself. I do not have the same relationship with all of my mentees. I work very hard to maintain the open lines of communication that we're going to talk about with all of them. But the way that that plays out and what that means for our specific interaction and how we remain accountable to one another is different. A good mentor is there to provide professional and social support. And I put emotional in there, although this is fairly contentious. Many would argue, I think, that emotional support may or may not be a characteristic of good academic mentorship. I argue that it is central to good academic mentorship. And if you do not feel comfortable providing that emotional support yourself, then it is a responsibility of the mentor, in my opinion, to provide the mentee with access to emotional support or resources where they can gain that support in other contexts. We are very lucky at UNLV, and I don't know how many of you are graduate students. I think most of you are. I don't know if you are aware of how lucky you are to have the graduate college as a safety net, kind of wrapping their arms all around you as graduate students. It's a very supportive environment, and it's a supportive environment that provides a lot of resources, even financial support right now. Even during COVID times, the graduate college has stepped up in order to try and help our community, the graduate student community at UNLV, do basic things like pay rent. Emotional support, I argue, is most certainly a characteristic of good mentorship, but that one is up to debate, and we can talk about it. I also think, finally, a very key characteristic of good mentorship is the demonstration of a variety of ways that there are for assisting and supporting mentees through their graduate careers and beyond. The reason I can't give you a laundry list of exactly what it looks like to be a good mentor is because that's very discipline specific. And it's also very individualistic. So it will look very different, but a variety of ways, a variety of means can be used to achieve the same goal, which is to support the mentee throughout their graduate experience, their graduate career, and ideally beyond as that relationship changes. There are several different stages of mentoring, and you all might find yourself in a different stage of this process. The first is initiation, and this is when both the mentor and the protege are getting to know each other. This is oftentimes, depending on the program or what academic discipline you're in, before you ever start graduate school. For most, at least I can talk about my own discipline of anthropology, in our department, and how it was for me as an anthropology student as well. This process of initiation started very early on after I had already started my program and I was in the program and I was kind of figuring out the lay of the land. That's when the initiation phase of my mentorship relationship, of my mentee relationship, I should say, with my mentors began. And that's certainly the stage when I begin my relationship. That's the time before, right when students are first starting grad school, that we begin. Cultivation, the steadiest and longest phase of the mentoring relationship. And this is typically the bulk of one's graduate career. And this is where a lot of the kinks are worked out. And so hopefully, ideally, if you have a good relationship with your mentor, then you will start the separation process, which begins before or slightly after the graduation of the mentee or protege and represents a dramatic shift in the relationship in terms of expectations, in terms of communication, in terms of what's expected of one another. And hopefully, if the cultivation and the separation have gone well, then it's time for the final stage of mentoring, which is redefinition. And this is when the mentoring connection continues after separation. The relationship has to be redefined to fit the new circumstances. So in my case, my relationship with my mentor had to be redefined when I was hired at UNLV, because now I was an assistant professor. I was on the tenure track myself. And so the type of advice and mentorship that I sought from my doctoral advisor changed to fit my own career stage. As my career has progressed and as I have grown as a scholar, and as I have also risen in rank, in academic rank, we're almost, if all goes well with my promotion this year, we will be at the same academic rank. She still holds a lot more experience than I do. I certainly seek out her mentorship for a variety of professional and personal reasons at this point in my life. But in terms of the actual rank, in many contexts, we are seen now as colleagues and less as mentor-mentee. And that's thanks to this redefinition of roles that we were able to achieve. There's mentorship in very different contexts. And depending on what discipline you hail from, this may be that you are seeking mentorship or you already have a mentor in regard to teaching, research, or even professionalism, professional conduct, professional expectations. In the case of the students who I mentor and the way that it works in our department in anthropology, which is in the College of Liberal Arts, all of these contexts are things that we kind of tailor our mentorship to in our program. And I have a quote here from 2005. It's from a guide from the University of Washington called Mentoring, How to Mentor Graduate Students. And it's actually a guide for faculty, but I have it here because I think it's really beautifully written and I think that it conveys an important message. Mentoring is a relationship. At the same time, it's a journey mentors and mentees embark on together. Throughout this journey, two or more individuals help each other arrive at a destination called professional excellence. Naturally, the journey can be challenging, with occasional muddy trails and blind spots, but with many more panoramic lookouts and high points. Good mentoring is simply the best way to get there. And I realize it's a little touchy-feely and we have to invoke we have to invoke a lot of imagery here, but I do think the point is well made, that it is a journey and that it requires both parties together to get to the destination. So how do you stay accountable to one another? How do mentors and mentees stay accountable to one another? There's a wide range of how-tos that you can find out in the world on the internet. These are the ones that I think work really well. These are the ones that I use in my own relationship with my mentees, and things that I found worked really well for me when I was a mentee and a protege. Regular communication, I can't stress it enough. It's why it's listed as the top one there. Regular communication is very key. Establishing clear mutual expectations. This means establishing expectations on both sides so that the mentor knows what you're expecting of them and you know what your mentor is expecting of you. Set mutually agreed upon deadlines for deliverables. This is a very important one because this is academic advising after all. So there are always deliverables that we have to pay attention to. Create a wide support network. It's impossible for one mentor to do all of the heavy lifting. It's impossible for one mentor to provide everything that a mentee might need. So creating a wide support network and a variety of mentors, even in varying capacities, is one way that I think helps for both parties to stay accountable to one another. There's other voices, there's other personalities in the mix that can help the situation. I think that IDPs work very well. These are individual development plans. A well-crafted IDP can act both as a planning tool and as a communication tool. It's something tangible. Well, in this case, it's usually virtual, but you get the idea. It's a document. It's a shared articulation. It's an understanding of where you want to go, how you're going to get there, and it provides a way to facilitate communication. And the creation of that IDP, you are communicating about these very important things. It allows the mentee to identify their research and their career goals, ideally, and to communicate these with their mentor in a context where you know precisely what the expectations are, that you are going to dialogue about this and come up with a plan of attack. I ran across this great article as I was researching for this presentation, and I wish that I had this piece of advice when I was a graduate student. I also am thinking that I'm going to send this to my own department, so the graduate students in my own department, because I think that this is a really great way to kickstart dialogue and kickstart a healthy relationship with your mentor where you have consistency and you have accountability and you have open communication. The article said that there are essentially 4 types of questions, 4 individual questions that you should ask your mentor early on. And you should continue asking these of your mentor throughout the first stages of your relationship. And the first is stories, to ask stories from your mentor. Stories about when they were a graduate student, stories about how they came into the discipline, stories about research that they conducted, or certain elements of teaching. So essentially ask them for stories of their own past so that you can better understand the person in front of you. The second is to ask a question, and repeatedly. I guess these should be 4 types of questions for your mentor. The second category is essentially situations. So bringing a situation yourself that you have experienced, or a problem that you need solved, so to speak, to your mentor, and asking them to help you solve that problem or navigate that situation. That is something that really develops, that cultivates the mentor-mentee relationship, is seeking advice on particular situations as they arise. The third category is self-awareness, and it's labeled as such, but it also is being open to critique and providing your mentor an opportunity to also compliment. So seeking out feedback on your work, on your presentations, conference posters, term papers, what have you, but seeking out that review and feedback from your advisor. And then having, the self-awareness to incorporate not only the complementary, hopefully there are both complementary aspects as well as constructive aspects, but being able to incorporate that as you move forward. And finally, skill building. And these are questions, well, how did you do this? How did you achieve X? How do you think I should achieve Y? What is your advice for doing that? So that will help you asking, do you think I really need to know this particular software problem? Or this software program, or how do you suggest I start building a stable of courses so that I have multiple syllabi ready to go when I hit the job market, things like that. So very practical skills as well as professional skill building. How does this process work? How do I write a cover letter to submit a journal article? How does it work when I want to go up for a certain type of scholarship? How does the nomination process work, right? So all of these things, every aspect of who you are as an academician is, you should be able to bring all of that to the table with your relationship with your mentor. Finally, just a reminder before we open it up for dialogue that mentorship matters. Mentors are not there to make us happy. They're not there to make you happy. They're not really there to be your best friend. They're certainly not there to be your enemy or your tormentor as well. They are there to guide us to the best of their knowledge. And there's a lot that we can unpack here because I think that oftentimes many mentors themselves either think that they're supposed to be your friend or your tormentor. And so that's something that we can certainly talk about together. But this is my final slide, and I leave this here just to remind us that mentorship matters, which we all know because we all chose to be here on a Thursday afternoon. But this is just my take, my very short take on what I think constitutes the basics for a good mentor-mentee relationship and how to start building that. Of course, there's a lot of variation, and every one of you is going to bring different skills, different personality, different academic disciplines and histories to the table. But this is just a good place for us to start, a good launching off point for dialogue. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I'm going to open up my, there we go. I'm going to open up my chat thread. Okay, so now we have all kinds of time. I'm happy to see a lot of you still on here. Hallelujah, I see a lot of names on here. My video turned off. Let's see, was my video on or off that whole time? I'm not sure.
It was on.
It was on, okay, I'm back now. Okay, everyone, so I think now is the time for us to open up for dialogue or questions. Not only necessarily about the presentation, but just in general. A sample or template for the IDP. Oh, there's so many. So that came from Sarah. There are so many online. I don't know how many of you, Sarah, I'm not sure if you were here last year or if this is your first year at UNLV, but the grad college has now instituted IDPs. There was some pushback for how comprehensive they were, but the grad college did have every graduate student at UNLV fill out a report that used to be your annual evaluation. But I'm not sure if you were aware, it was a lot meatier last year. There was more information. Your advisor or whoever was the graduate coordinator for your department had to essentially report whether or not you were on track or off track, what you needed to do to get on track. It was really a basic bare bones IDP, and I'm really thrilled that Emily Lynn, the associate dean, and her office made these mandatory, because I think it was a critical first step in this accountability process. There are all sorts of great IDPs online if you would like to do something that's more individualized for your program. I'm going to pull up a good one and dump it into the chat thread for you. So I guess my point is that I say definitely start with the UNLV one that is, let's see, that is handed out to you. All right, let's see if I can find the one I'm looking for. Well, I'm looking for that. Does anyone else have another question?
Guys, feel free to add a question to the chat, or if you can also just unmute yourself and then you can ask the question directly.
Dr. Crittenton, great presentation. Thank you.
I actually have a question. When you're trying to kind of cultivate this relationship with your mentor, are you direct with your questions, or is this something that just it's just fluid?
Hi, Jonathan. So nice to see your photo there. I'm not sure I'm understanding. You mean it's always fluid, it's always building, right? There are multiple stages. There's a growth of any relationship. I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you ask again?
Yeah, would you be able to open your presentation? And there was some key points that were kind of like the stages from
Oh, sure.
that a mentorship kind of it develops in, I think it was separation,
Sure.
initiation. Well,
Sure.
in those each of those steps, how are you approaching each of
I
those?
think you mean
Is that
this.
like a
Do you mean
yeah,
this
that
slide,
one?
Jonathan? Okay.
Exactly that one. So, I mean, initiation and cultivation is, I see that as more fluid, but when it comes to separation and redefining, are you approaching and be like, all right, well, I'm done with my education. Um, how do we continue this relationship, or how do you approach that?
Well, that's a great question. There is no one pat answer. I can give you an example that happened to me just yesterday that might help you better understand my approach to these phases. I had an undergraduate mentee who was a researcher in my working group for years. COVID, there's a whole nother thing that we can talk about in terms of virtual mentorship and how you do this right in the pandemic age where we're all on screens with one another, but it is possible and the same principles apply. But this particular undergraduate student graduated last spring and is going on to graduate school in California. And I hadn't seen them in some time. And they approached me and said, can we say goodbye before I go on to graduate school? Can we meet for a coffee? So we met yesterday for a socially distanced coffee on campus. And we started our process of separation. So this was quite some time after this individual had finished working in my lab as an undergrad, and also quite some time since we'd seen each other. But we started our separation then, and we talked about our communication moving forward. And they asked if it would be all right if they could send me some questions as they start graduate school, because they don't have a graduate mentor yet, and would I be open to that? And we made plans to keep in touch. And when they're back in Las Vegas over winter break, we made plans to get together for another coffee. That's an undergrad relationship. So those sometimes have, real hooks, and they sometimes don't. They sometimes you lose track of those students. But that's where our separation started. So a redefinition will be the next time we're in communication together, will I be the person who they're asking for advice? It will be defined in terms of kind of what the mentee needs out of that relationship, not really what I need out of it anymore. The way that it works in graduate relationships is very different, but obviously the same type of intense communication and that accountability that you have for work or shared deadlines is not the same once you have graduated and you leave your program. And so that's where the separation happens. And oftentimes this separation can be in unhealthy or not very strong mentor-mentee relationships. It's problematic from the get-go. All stages are fraught with issues, and the separation is sometimes a relief for the mentee. Sometimes for the mentee, the separation phase is freedom, and the redefinition is we're done, right? So this is an ideal situation in which you have a good, strong, positive, mutually beneficial mentor-mentee relationship. Those are not always, we wish that those were the gold standard, but that's often not the case. So this looks different for every relationship. So I can do my best to answer that question, but it does look different. So, okay, I stopped sharing and I found the resources for Sarah that I want to send. Okay. All right, so I'm going to put something in the chat thread first of all. Let's see. Wonder. There we go. So those are some characteristics of IDPs, and there are several different resources. So here's one that you can just kind of get some information. It's from a website called mysciencecareers.org. So there's one resource that I think is really good. Here is a good one for humanities and social sciences. It's called Imagine PhD. And I can also put together some of this information and it can be circulated. So if you would like access to any of these websites that I'm putting into the chat thread, please feel free to email me or to email anyone from the grad college who you see on your screen there today, and they can get these sources to you. A template, let's see, I'm trying to see if I can find the template. There is also a template, a pretty good one. I know that University of Oregon has a great one. The link doesn't seem to be working. Let's see if I can get it up there. All right, my link isn't working for my University of Oregon one. Okay, here's a model one, a good one, I think, from the University of Southern California that looks a little different. It's a little more comprehensive than the one that we have, but there's some great ideas for you. And there's also a great resource on YouTube from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Let's see if I can find that one really quickly. Oh, it's playing. I found it. Okay, paused it, and here's a YouTube link for a great resource. Okay, Sarah, that should get you started for kind of some idea of what in the heck I'm talking about with that. Okay, any other questions or anything else that anyone would like to talk about while we're here, while you have me tethered to this chair?
I have a question.
Sure, Jasmine.
So I am mentoring two undergraduates. They do research with me on my thesis project. And I was just wondering, I know you mentioned like coffee earlier, but what are like some other appropriate ways to kind of reward your mentees and keep them motivated, especially in the thick of research?
That's a great question. You're discussing a really challenging thing for me as a mentor, right? Because I see an undergrad here on the screen who did amazing work in my lab, no longer an undergrad, but was an undergrad, working in our lab. The project ended, but I'm gonna pick on Mar for a minute because she did such great work, but she was not technically my mentee, right? So I also had to navigate my mentor-mentee relationship with her graduate mentor, her graduate student mentor, because it was my job to mentor the mentor. Does that make sense? So there was a degree of separation there where I had to navigate those roles myself. I think just open lines of communication, having strong communication where you feel you can speak to one another respectfully, but get your questions answered, and to really have a good understanding of what's expected of you as a mentee. I think that's the biggest gift you can give your mentee, is just listening to them, actively listening to them, helping them achieve whatever they tell you their goals are. I really like to, COVID has kind of put a damper on this, but I also like to make sure that the meetings that I have with my mentees are not only in the office or in the lab or only in regard to work. I try very hard to make sure that we can go share a meal together. That has been challenging in COVID. Hopefully the students that I currently have, I've already fed them enough that they know kind of where I stand, and I will be feeding them again very, very soon. But I try to ask them about who they are and learn about who they are as a person outside of the context of just an academic meeting. So for me, that's something that I think is very valuable, that has worked.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I've got an anonymous question,
Oh,
actually.
okay, great. I was going to
So
say, if
this,
not, you can have some of your life back, but I'm here. Shoot.
so this person asked, how can I measure my success as a mentor?
Wow, that's a doozy. Measuring success as a mentor. I think the biggest way that you can measure success as a mentor is to talk to your mentee. I often have very open discussions with my mentees and ask what they need and ask if I'm facilitating growth, if I'm doing what they need, if there's anything that I can do or that we can do together that's what are we doing that's working, what are we doing that's not working, if it's not working, how can we change it? I think that for me the shortest answer is to directly discuss that with your mentee, because I think at that point, if it goes terribly wrong, if it's just a crash and burn disaster, when you have that kind of check in with your mentee, then it might be time to just start over from the beginning. And again, making those expectations very clear on both sides. Well, this is kind of what I think my job is as your mentor. What do you think my job is as your mentor? I think starting off with something very, very basic like that is a way to get started in the right direction. And hopefully, the way you can tell if all of that investment has paid off is your mentee is successful. They are seeking your advice, and that separation stage that I was talking about with Jonathan, that separation stage means that they're still seeking your advice and your guidance as they're pivoting away from this experience and moving on to the next one, and they want to maintain that relationship as it moves forward. I think that's another a good sign that you're being a good mentor.
Excellent. Hopefully that answered their question. And there's another one too. So this person says, I know that cultivating a mentoring relationship takes time, but what if difficulties between the mentor and mentee are persistent? How long should we allow the relationship to grow before, I guess, giving up or seeking kind of like a different pairing?
That's a great question. And I think, again, we mentioned this, but I'll be much more frank about this right now in answering these questions. Sometimes it's not a good fit. And it doesn't matter how hard you work. Sometimes it is not a good fit, or only one party is interested, whether that party is the mentor or the mentee. Sometimes only one party is interested in having a good relationship and facilitating this type of dialogue and accountability. If that's the case, I would say it varies by academic discipline. But I would say give it the old college try. Make sure that you perhaps work through an IDP together with that mentor. If it is an unmitigated disaster, trying to sit down and come up with with this tangible thing that you can work on together to facilitate your growth and your progression. If that just does not work at all, then my piece of advice is to seek mentorship outside of that person. In many instances in a graduate program, at least this is the way that it is in our department, unless it is catastrophically bad, unless it has become a totally dysfunctional relationship, most graduate students can't really pivot away from their advisor. It also depends on the level of collaboration that they've been involved in, the level of kind of how deep in the weeds are they together in terms of their shared research. But what I always tell students in our program to do is to seek mentorship, additional mentorship elsewhere. So get what you need from another mentor. If it's emotional support, if it's social networking, if it's help solving a different type of problem, if it's just actually getting that feedback, those compliments, and that constructive criticism. If you don't even feel comfortable sharing your work with your mentor, but you can't escape them for reasons, some of the reasons I just outlined, then my advice is to seek ancillary support elsewhere to help you through that. If you don't have the option of ancillary support, there are resources at the grad college. There are people that you can talk to if it's really bad. If you have a mentor who is abusive in your relationship, there are resources available to you. You usually should be able to talk to your graduate coordinator. If you don't feel comfortable talking to your graduate coordinator, there are resources available at the grad college to help you find the support that you need to figure out what next steps need to be taken. Okay, there's a question in the chat thread. Sometimes you can be sought out regularly as a mentor, enjoy helping others, but still feel like a mentee helping another rather than truly embracing oneself as a mentor. Whew, yeah, no, I don't have any suggestions. That's very poignant. I think that's a very accurate comment. I think, as I said, in many instances, I'm a mentor, and in many instances, I myself am still a mentee. And so I'm constantly navigating that space myself in terms of what I can learn from others and what I've learned and how I can use what I've learned to help others. So, you know, I mean, it's a tough one. I think that the biggest suggestion would be, if you're just starting out as a mentor, you know, to actually do some work, I actually read a lot about, I didn't want the same experience. I didn't want my graduate students to have the same experience I had early on, where we had to go through trials and tribulations. It was a relationship, you know, that was, I mean, it was forged in fire. The relationship I had with my mentor and have now, and it was not good for me. It did not facilitate speedy progress through my program. It did not make me feel like I was doing a very good job. It was not a very nourishing relationship. I actively started to be a better mentee. And I think that's when our relationship changed. But I made it a point that I wanted to read some of the literature and some of the very good academic scholarship on what a successful mentor-mentee relationship looks like. There are a lot of resources available for being a good mentor. All one need to do is Google, you know, tips for graduate mentorship. And or even link to some of the things I put in the chat thread there. And on the mentor side, there are ways that you can do better. Again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but the number one thing I also do is ask my mentees, what works best for you? Do weekly meetings work best for you? Would you like to meet every 2 weeks? Do you need hard deadlines? Do you like soft deadlines? I'm constantly checking in with them to see what they need. And we've been together now for years, all of my mentees and I. And so now they tell me, okay, I'm going to need you a lot this semester, or I'm really kind of just really busy writing and I don't want to have weekly meetings for a semester. You know, I mean, so it changes for me, but I think that's my only advice is, I think we're all a mentor and a mentee, and I think that's a very astute observation. And I think the fact that you made that observation suggests to me that you are a good mentor, because you have that self-reflection that I think is part of that, is part of making sure that you are a good mentor. And the humility to ask the question also, to me, indicates that you're a good mentor. There's a couple of students in my own department who could have stood to be on this workshop, and they're not here, despite me suggesting that this might be a great thing to do. So, you know, who have undergrad mentees themselves. Any other questions, or Jasmine, any anonymous questions to throw my way?
Here's one. How can I build trust effectively with my mentee with only a few hours of contact each week?
You have to make those few hours count. Those few hours, a few hours a week in, like, so for me, I did a lot of bench work also, both in my undergrad and my graduate research careers, which meant that I did a lot of lab work in addition to field work, and in addition to work on my own writing papers and researching. And I did a myriad of different types of work. But for bench work, when I was in the lab with a mentor, that was very different than sitting down and having one-on-one meetings. So my first point would be to suggest that those hours also include one-on-one back and forth, one-on-one discussion of how's it going? What are you learning? What are you reading? What are you working on? What are our goals for this semester? You can even start very small. What are our goals for this semester? And then you can start building out a plan rather than just active work together, which I don't know if you have that and if the individual who posed the question has that, but there are ways to make even a few hours a week very meaningful. Again, I would say once every couple of months to try and get together with the mentee outside of the lab or office context. Let's have a coffee. Now, COVID, of course, has changed this, so I'm not advocating for any face-to-face meetings right now, unless everyone is safe and can meet up safely. But hopefully, eventually, I know it seems like never, but I think at some point we will be able to safely meet up face-to-face again, or even just meeting up socially distanced if you're comfortable doing that. Socially distanced and or masked. I think just getting that connection with the mentee, maybe outside of just a strict work context, is important. We have started a program, we'll see if it actually takes off, but we started a graduate peer mentorship program in the Department of Anthropology. And one of the things that we realized is that mentees were feeling very isolated, not only from their mentors, but also from their peers. And so they didn't actually feel really motivated to have any type of connection with their mentor because they felt very unconnected to the departmental community in general to begin with. So we're trying to alleviate all of this stuff. We're trying to fix all these problems that are concurrent problems. And one of the ways we're doing that is this graduate mentorship program to try and facilitate communication and social interaction and academic and social support for students amongst themselves, where they then feel like they have a community, which I think will also empower them in some ways to also work towards more communication and a better relationship with their mentor. That was kind of a long-winded answer, but hopefully there was some nugget in there that was useful.
Perfect. Any other questions, anyone?
I have a quick one. So I teach a couple of classes and they're lab classes, so I spend a lot of like FaceTime with my students. And I feel like I should be considered a mentor to them, and that's the relationship that I want. But I think because there's a grade aspect involved, they kind of see me as, I don't know, the enemy or the person with the red pen or something like that. So do you have any recommendations on maybe de-emphasizing the I control your grade and therefore your future aspect and emphasizing the I'm here to help you grow and develop aspect?
That's a great question. Naomi, I think, is that, I couldn't tell who was speaking. I want to make sure I'm addressing
Yeah,
this.
that was me.
Oh, great. Okay. That's a great question. It's a very complicated one to answer. So thank you, I think, for that question. So my first piece of advice would be to remind you, or remind all of us that teaching a class, being an instructor, being a pedagogue is not necessarily the same thing as being a mentor. Mentor-mentee relationships do develop over time. They typically last a lot longer than one semester or the duration of a course. So being an instructor or a professor, an educator who is very supportive and can help those individuals succeed outside of the context of a class is something that does take facilitation to develop. So I would also just try to cut yourself a little bit of a break in terms of separating the responsibilities that you hold for being a good educator who is supportive and listens and kind of fosters growth versus being a mentor to these individuals, which in many instances, I mean, it can happen in one semester, but in those, it's often longer. And it would be hard to be a mentor to 25 people at a time. I mean, that's one of the, I think a great, there's some pretty robust data that are out there and on mentoring and what it looks like to be a successful, what mentees report as a successful mentor relationship. And these data really indicate, particularly at the graduate level, which we can extrapolate for you to the lab courses you're teaching. I'm assuming for undergrads. I don't know if these are for grads or undergrads, but these data indicate that the more mentees that any given advisor has, typically the mentees are less satisfied with that relationship. So it's also, this is something I kind of a broken record to my own department. because I'm constantly encouraging them to really invest heavily in the graduate students that they do have, kind of a love the one you're with kind of thing, right? But we also have to be aware that the university is really kind of requires growth and expansion in order to function, in order to maintain R1 status. And so there's a lot of pressure for graduate programs in particular to keep growing, even though the responsibilities on an individual mentor to have additional students is really challenging. So I would just say try to balance those roles that you have for yourself, and remember that you can't be an ideal mentor to every student you teach, because I think that's a big, heavy lift for you. Okay, so there's stuff in the chat thread. Looks like we're probably out of time. Do we have time, Jasmine, for one final question, if anyone has one?
We are out of time.
Okay. Well, you can
I just
email
actually
me.
left. Yes, you can definitely email Dr. Crittenden. I did leave a link in the chat to fill out a feedback survey. So please, 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 if you have a moment, go ahead and fill this out, and that can help us improve upon future workshops.
And that can help
Thank
me
you
as
guys
well.
all for coming.
If Jasmine gives me some
Yes.
tips, right, to help me be a better mentor. All right, everyone, thank you so much. Have a great weekend, and thanks for joining us. Bye.
Thank you.